Welcome everyone to our Facebook Live discussion on bioethics in public health. We're coming to you live from the NYU College of Global Public Health. We're going to be talking to two awesome assistant professors and faculty fellows from the NYU Center for Bioethics. We're going to be talking about bioethics, what it is, and its role in our healthcare system and public health. My name is Deborah Nakamaya. I'm going to be your host today. I'm joined by Professor Chelsea Rosenthal and Professor Jordan McKenzie. Thank you guys so much for being here on our show.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Awesome. So, and to our audience, please leave our panelists questions below as the discussion goes on. They're ready to answer all your questions, and I'm really excited for this awesome bioethics discussion. Awesome. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So, to those not in the bioethics field, how would you explain, what bioethics is? A lot of people are unsure of, how an MA fits into this field. Can you give us some details about, its role in public health and all that good stuff? Okay.
Sure. So bioethics is a field that investigates ethical questions related to medicine, healthcare, new biotechnologies, and biological research, and also more broadly questions about our relationship to other biological systems, so our obligations to animals and the environment. And so this can mean everything from questions about doctors' obligations to patients, questions about when we should be willing to compromise one individual's autonomy in order to serve greater public health goods. It can mean questions about the ethics of using new reproductive technologies or genetic engineering, questions about what sorts of environmental policies are ethical, questions about our obligations to animals. Anything along those lines would fall broadly under the heading of just questions that we're investigating.
Wow. And, how did you get into this field?
So my training, and really the training of everyone at the center, is grounded in philosophy, but I'm interested in a lot of applied questions in philosophy, how to use some of the insights from philosophy to deal with these types of questions. So a lot of my research has been related to questions about moral uncertainty, and some of the key cases and examples that get used there relate to questions that bioethicists are interested in. So situations where someone might be unsure of the moral status of fetuses or the moral status of animals. And those are also the kinds of questions that bioethics engages with.
That's good. How about you? How did you
get
into...
I have a similar trajectory to Chelsea's. I have a PhD in philosophy from UNC Chapel Hill, go Tar Heels. And in my PhD, I was working on fairly theoretical questions. Questions in normative ethics, which is the area of ethics that deals with what we ought to do, basically. And I was specifically looking at questions related to the value of self-knowledge. So why we should care about knowing ourselves. Is it reasonable for us to want self-knowledge that we know won't be practically valuable or might actually really harm us in significant ways? And a lot of my dissertation was arguing, yes, it is fully reasonable. It makes sense for people to value self-knowledge kind of as its own end, as worth having for its own sake. So I got into bioethics in large part because I saw kind of practical parallels to the questions I was asking my dissertation in medical ethics, right? So what's the value of knowing specific details about your diagnosis? There's a practical value, but you might think there's also a value just like in terms of your identity. Now I I better understand my experience. And there are also these great questions emergent, throughout research ethics. How much data do we owe participants? Do we owe it to them to provide them with information that's not going to be clinically actionable, that might even kind of call into question the scientific validity of a research trial, insofar as it might make them less representative of a population? So a lot of my bioethics interests are just extensions of the theoretical work I was doing before.
You guys are deep thinkers. Wow, who am I?
Not in my spare time.
Wow. And you guys have really talked a little bit about your research. Can you give us examples, Professor McKenzie, about moral dilemmas and things like that?
Yeah. So one project that I'm just starting to get work done on in the little bit of spare time I have this time in the semester has to do with ethical obligations related to family caregivers. So a lot of bioethical discussions proceed sort of like this. The two major morally relevant people in bioethics are the patient on the one hand and the medical provider on the other. And in actuality, the American healthcare system has a lot of other ethically relevant players, right? And one type of person I'm interested in is the family caregiver. So I think they occupy this kind of morally weird territory where they're vulnerable in a lot of the same ways that the patient is, but they're not entitled to the same protections that a patient might be. So they're not entitled to, say, access to the patient's medical records. And they're also expected to do a lot of actual medical work, right? Family caregiving is often pretty sophisticated at this point, despite not having actual training. So I'm interested in questions like, do we actually owe it to our aging parents to take care of them? How much should we be willing to sacrifice in order to promote their well-being? It's one thing to visit mom and dad on the weekend, and it's another thing to move home and upend your life. And kind of from a more societal level, is this labor that ought to be compensated? Should we view this as kind of a skilled profession that people enter into? And should we be concerned about this from a justice perspective, insofar as a lot of the people who are doing family caregiving are women, and might already be vulnerable. So those are some of the questions that I'm interested in right now.
Those are deep things.
Yeah, I mean they're deep and depressing, but also interesting, and I mean they're questions we all confront in our life.
Yeah, that's really true. And what does your research really look like?
Yeah. Sorry. So I'm interested in situations where we want to do the right thing, but we might not be sure what the right thing is. And so then we have to make a bunch of decisions about how to navigate that kind of uncertainty. So we might think about certain cases where we should put more time and energy into really trying to sort of solve a moral dilemma. Other cases where we might decide to sort of hedge our bets and not do something that we think might seem a little morally iffy, just in case, because we know it's too hard to sort out. And some cases where we'll think, look, I can't fuss over this. I'm just going to forge ahead and do this, even though I'm not entirely certain. And we're going to have to do some of that just to get through our day-to-day, just sort of our day-to-day activities. And so part of what I'm interested in is how to tell which cases are which. Is this a case where you're supposed to sacrifice a lot to avoid doing something that might be morally wrong just because you're not sure? Or is this something where you can go ahead? And part of what I've done in my work is try to say, look, if we have real obligations to navigate that uncertainty in responsible ways, to not be reckless about it, to not be arrogant about the certainty of our own moral judgments, if we have those obligations, that might be able to actually better explain a lot of other seemingly puzzling features of our moral lives. So one that I'm interested in is interpersonal toleration. So there are lots of situations where you might think that your friends or your neighbors are doing something morally wrong, but where it also seems like there's something morally good about being tolerant of their behavior, even though you think it's wrong. And so I'm interested, for example, in cases where someone who's an adamant vegan is actually very tolerant of friends who eat meat, or someone who's an adamant pro-lifer is tolerant and maybe supportive of friends who are choosing to get abortions. And in some sense, it looks like this might be puzzling if they really believe that these things are as bad as they say. But it also seems like there's something morally good about being tolerant in those cases. And part of what I try to do to explain that is think about the way in which we have moral responsibilities to be conscious of the possibility that we might be making mistakes in our moral judgments, and that it can be morally good to be careful in light of that reality. So that's part of what I've been writing about and thinking about.
It's out of this world right now. For our viewers, please leave awesome questions for our panel. I have a billion questions, but I'll stick to the script. What would you say that medical professionals have a right to, conscientiously object to certain procedures?
Yeah, I mean, so this kind of touches on a lot of Chelsea's work as well.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of live question in bioethics right now about whether healthcare professionals should be allowed to refuse to perform certain medical procedures that are considered to be part of standard medical practice. So you see this coming up most recently in relation to physician-assisted euthanasia, right? If I'm a palliative care doctor who signed on to be a palliative care doctor before this became legal, do I have any obligation to provide people with it if I morally object to it? Do I have any obligation to refer them to other providers who will provide it? You'll also see it in relation to like abortion. Do doctors have an obligation to perform an abortion or even just to prescribe birth control? And then do pharmacists have an obligation to fill birth control prescriptions if they, or Plan B prescriptions if they morally oppose it? And one thing I love about this question is that I'm genuinely uncertain about the answer. Like, yeah, right? So, and it's a question that I just talked about with my graduate seminar this semester. And I came out probably more uncertain than I was at the beginning. Because on the one hand, tolerance seems like a real virtue, right? It seems like we should, accept that people are going to have a plurality of different moral beliefs, right? And we should be hesitant to assume that ours are invariably the right one. And conscientious objection seems to really get at that, right? There's also just value in being able to live in accordance with your ideals. But on the other hand, as a practice, conscientious objection tends to really only affect certain groups of the population, like typically women, and typically women in rural areas, right? So there's this concern that a small segment of the population is kind of bearing the burdens of a doctor or medical professional's conscientious objection. So yeah, so short answer, bioethicists aren't good at giving short answers, but I'm genuinely uncertain. I think it's like a real moral dilemma that we need to continue to try to wade through.
Wow, is there even an answer at all? What would you have to say to that?
Oh, I mean, I think it is a really fraught issue, and I think it'll depend a lot on the particulars of what exactly is being objected to, and what sorts of accommodations the objector is requesting. So it would be one thing to request an accommodation that would amount to one of your colleagues taking over the work, but everyone still having the same access to care. And I think it would be a very different thing to request accommodations that really result in someone not having access to care. So I think it's, partly for that reason, very difficult to give a generalized answer.
I don't know. I'm just amazed by all of this. And moving on to like companies like 23andMe that assess, the origins of genes. What are some implications of these type of companies on like the future of healthcare, would you say?
Yeah, so this gets into some of the work that I do in relation to like medical self-knowledge, as I often call it.
Yeah.
There are so many issues with 23andMe, and I say this as a complete hypocrite because I have totally done the 23andMe thing and love it, and pore over that data, and I find it really satisfying.
Yeah.
On the other hand, one of the biggest issues that we're coming up against now is that 23andMe is a for-profit company, and it's going to make money off information that we've provided, and often provided not really recognizing what it is that we're providing. So there's this big live question about who owns our DNA, right? Who owns our genetic profile, our genetic sequence? Is it the person who provided it, right? It's you.
Say yes.
Yeah, right? or is it the people who paid to have it analyzed, right? So there's also this question about whether you can kind of contract away information about your DNA, right? Can you, even if you kind of own it as a default, can you consent to other people being able to license it, to use it, to sell it to third parties? There's also just huge issues about what even consent means when we're talking about a company like 23andMe. So I don't know about you, maybe I'm the only one who does this, but whenever I see a long consent form, like, I don't read it. And I know I should, like I'm a bioethicist,
I don't read it
but nobody
either.
does, right?
Yeah.
And so like 23andMe has this huge consent form, they've covered their bases, but we have to ask, is it informed consent if people had an opportunity to read it, but the people providing the consent form knew reasonably that they weren't going to? So yeah, huge issues all around, and also an incredibly edifying service.
Yeah. What would you have, any comments on 23andMe?
Oh, so I find 23andMe, it's an interesting case, partly because it's difficult to do meaningful consent in advance when what kinds of uses your genetic information can be put to are going to change over time. So even if we think now, oh, well, this company is ending up with this information about me, and I might have a sense of what sorts of things they might do with it today, but what they're able to do with it 20 or 30 years from now may be very different, and they'll still have the information at that point. And so I think that's one of the especially interesting dimensions of questions about genetic information at this particular moment in time.
Yes, and I would say, aside from, academia, what prospects would you say are for students who decide to pursue bioethics, or how does that fit into the space of public health and
So students in our program go through a lot of different routes, and it depends partly on what their interests are, partly on their background coming into the program. So a number of our students are in the medical field. So some continue on to medical school after graduating from our program. We also have a couple of doctors who are doing our program part-time while continuing to practice medicine, sort of giving themselves an opportunity to reflect on some of the ethical issues that they engage with in their work. And we also have students along similar paths who might go on to work in medical research or to take on other roles in the healthcare field. And some people also will do other work connected to medical research or to medicine. So, sorry. For example, serving on an institutional review board, reviewing research, and there will also be a number of our students who are interested in engaging with these issues in a philosophical setting. So a lot of our students go on to philosophy PhD programs to continue to do this type of research. And there will also be students who will be sort of using this as a foundation for careers in law or policy. And there can be a variety of combinations. So someone might do, for example, our program plus an MD, and then go work as a clinical ethicist in a hospital doing ethics consultations for doctors who want to sit down and say, look, here's an ethical question that we're facing right now in this hospital. What kind of guidance can you provide? And so our program in combination with, say, an MD, or in some cases a JD, or a philosophy PhD, would be a path towards that as well.
Wow, there's so many facets
Yeah.
to bioethics,
It's a huge field.
Yeah, it's very, I would say, just like public health as
Exactly,
well. It's
yeah.
very diverse, you can go so many ways,
Yeah. And I mean, there are a set of bioethical issues that arise, I think, fairly uniquely in public health too. So we have had students in the past either, go on to work as public health professionals, do an MPH after, something like that. So, I mean, a lot of public health is focused on questions about how you weigh the public good against individual rights and liberties, right? And these are questions that bioethics is centrally concerned with. So, how coercive can we be in terms of instilling good habits in people, or making sure that people are behaving in a way that's not going to put an undue burden on our health system? At what point do we cross a line to become 1984, basically, right?
Wow, that's a really amazing. And what would you say, or what do you think is the biggest misconception about bioethics?
So, sorry. Work in bioethics can take a lot of different forms, and I think one thing that's valuable for people to realize is that sort of this work can be done in different traditions and in different ways. So the framework that we use in our center here is very much philosophical. So our faculty are all trained in philosophy, and a lot of our practice of bioethics is really trying to use the kinds of frameworks that are provided by ethical analysis and philosophy, and bring them to bear on these very applied questions that we're trying to navigate as bioethicists. At the same time that we also encourage our students to get real-world experience doing this, so we have a practicum component of our program as well. So I think it's just sort of worth being aware that bioethics can look different in a lot of different spaces.
I think there's also sometimes a misconception that your ethical work is done if you're in a profession that has a professional ethics code. Like, so long as I kind of don't do this stuff that's going to get me fired, do this stuff, care about patients, care about, people's rights and so forth, then I'm good to go. Like a lot of what I've realized through, far too many years doing, bioethics and philosophy, is that ethics is just really hard. And it's kind of like, it's, even if you have like a set of rules that you're following, it's really hard to figure out how they apply to a situation, what to do when they come into conflict, what to do when, a rule clearly applies, but you still feel morally, divided about it, right? So these are the sorts of issues that we're looking at here, right? And I think like it's important to keep in mind that this stuff is just complicated, and there often aren't clear, easy answers.
Yeah, there's no right or wrong answer. There's
I mean, there can be right and wrong answers, but I don't think it's going to be easy to find them. But yeah, I do think that it is crucially important to realize that there's not a way for someone else to just write you a list of rules and then for you to be sort of off the hook thinking, I don't have to engage in any moral contemplation because someone else already gave me the answers. Because you're still responsible for knowing whether those really are the right answers. And that's ultimately not something that's going to be easily resolved in advance.
We have an audience question from Santiago, and he would like to know if you guys have heard of, good health centers that provide, end-of-life care. Is there a moral argument to oppose, such practices?
Good. So just for clarification, are you thinking about centers that are going to just provide a hospice model, or centers that are going to provide some sort of physician-assisted suicide?
I would say probably we can answer for both.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, this is an interesting question. What constitutes a good death, and to what extent are we obligated to provide it to people? Up to and including, to what extent are we obligated to make sure that people have the ability to end their lives in advance of them having to experience things that they don't think are worth experiencing. I think there are moral arguments on both sides, right? On the one hand, I often think that people are the best judges of, what conditions are actually livable for them. And I think that there are certain illnesses, like, with which no matter how much hospice care you get, death is going to be very unpleasant. On the other hand, there are real worries about abusing these practices, right? It's one thing if I'm completely competent to make a decision about ending my life. It's another thing if I've tried to make that decision in advance, then get dementia, seem pretty happy in this dementia state despite previously having requested that my life end before that happened, right? So there are just going to be huge issues related to kind of policing this practice, making sure that it doesn't extend past cases that are morally reasonable, what to do with abuses of that practice, what to do if people feel like they're coerced into this practice. Yeah,
and I think there can be real tensions too with sort of broader questions about social justice. So even if we advocate access to euthanasia under ideal circumstances, if we know that in practice there's not currently equitable access to good medical care, would we worry about people feeling pressured to opt for that or opting for it because they didn't have access to affordable medical care that would otherwise be easing their pain at end of life, or that because they're worried about creating expenses for their families. And there are worries especially about whether those burdens would fall disproportionately on already disadvantaged populations. So those are some of the ways that it becomes complicated, even though I think there is real value to people having the autonomy to control their own end-of-life decisions.
And I would even go further to ask, what if younger, people, so maybe a child with cancer who's like 15.
Yeah, so I mean, this is like, one of the issues that Belgium is confronting. Where do you put limits on the practice, right?
Exactly.
It's one thing if 85, terminal cancer has had this.
Like, I'm done.
Yeah, and has had this preference. It's another
Yeah.
case if you have a gravely ill 15-year-old, or kind of extending the practice further, somebody who's just experienced years of mental anguish. So some arguments have been made that people with mental health conditions ought to have access to these services as well. This is the stage
very
where
controversial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, the pediatric cases are going to be very challenging.
Yeah.
But they might not be challenging in ways that are particularly unique to that practice, right? Like pediatric ethics tends to just be complicated because you're dealing with someone who has preferences, but kind of legally doesn't have the autonomy to express those preferences.
Yeah.
And you also have to worry, to what extent are these preferences just a function of their parents telling them certain things. So, yeah, I mean, these are going to be really hard issues. I would say in the pediatric case, as a starting point, we should be very cautious about the child's age, about the amount of information they can comprehend about their condition. But we also shouldn't undersell the extent to which terminally ill children and teenagers are aware of what's going on in their lives, right, and are able to make value judgments.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was an awesome
Yeah, thank you, Santiago.
audience question. We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk more about, there's a course in the summer.
Oh, this is Chelsea's running this.
All right, awesome. So do you want to tell us a little bit about
Sure, yeah, I'm excited about this. I'm going to be teaching a course on the role of scientific expertise in a democracy. So there can be a lot of tensions between what the scientific consensus is on a particular issue and what the general public believes on that issue. So we see this especially on topics like climate change. On the other hand, in a democracy, we value having the public, at least in some sense, guide our policymaking. And that can be really difficult if we want to also have scientifically informed policymaking. And so part of what we're going to be engaging with in the seminar is exactly how to make sense of those competing values. So we're going to discuss some general democratic theory as background, getting a sense of different understandings of why exactly it is so important that the public be able to guide our policy making, and then using that as a foundation for discussions of some of these hard circumstances that arise, say in debates about climate change or teaching evolution in public schools and so on. Trying to think both about how we've gotten into this situation with this kind of discrepancy, looking at some work, say, on propaganda, but also trying to think more about what this can look like moving forward, what some of our options are for navigating this. And I don't think there are going to be easy answers, but sort of looking at least some of the competing values that arise. So when is it preferable to give more control to government bureaucrats with specialized knowledge? When is that an unacceptable way of handling these circumstances? What kind of role can education play in trying to get us out of this mess? And trying to sort of look at that, and then also step back and look at the way in which science itself can be non-neutral and values can come into the scientific process, and some of the ways in which that complicates this problem as well.
Wow, that's going to be an exciting course to take.
I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, and also there's an undergrad minor that's coming up. Do you want to tell us?
Yes, so we're really excited about this. So any undergrads watching along at home, this is for you. We are launching a bioethics minor through the Center for Bioethics. The courses will primarily be offered through Global Public Health, and this is starting in the fall, though I believe some or all of our courses are now on Albert. And in this minor, students will be required to take 2 mandatory courses, an Intro to Bioethics course and an Intro to Public Health Ethics course, and they'll have a range of electives that they can take as well. So in the fall, in addition to Intro to Bioethics, students can take an Introduction to Medical Ethics course through the philosophy department, but offered by one of our professors, that will talk about bioethical issues, particularly obtaining in medical settings, as well as a reproductive ethics course. So this will be looking at questions like, is abortion permissible, and if so, under what circumstances and for what reasons? Is it wrong of us to have children given our current
overpopulated
world?
Yeah.
So, and in the spring, I'll be offering an undergrad Intro to Disability Ethics, which I'm very excited about. So yeah, we look forward to filling those courses and growing the minor.
Wow, that's so much is going on at the center, I think.
It's a lively place.
I would also say, switching gears, and we're winding down a little bit, some of the things that we want to end with are, what's currently happening. So in this current political climate, how can we communicate, science to policymakers, under, especially, this current administration, like specific strategies?
So I wish there were easy answers to this.
I think this is a theme.
Yeah.
Especially in the current environment, I don't think there's any especially easy way to resolve this. I think a lot of what's going to need to happen will be long-term cultural change and educational efforts, and just sort of dialogue within the country that at this point is basically cross-cultural dialogue. We're a very divided country, and I think we do need to figure out better ways to have that kind of cross-cultural dialogue if we're going to be moving forward. But I don't know that there's an easy way to get the current administration to be responsive. Certainly, I think there have been activist efforts that have made some headway, but it's clearly not a traditional situation where you might be able to expect them to be responsive to sort of ordinary channels of describing scientific research.
Are you of the same school of thought?
Yeah, this is a particularly depressing note to end on, I hate to say. But this actually does bring up one of the things that I love so much about teaching and doing bioethics, which is that it gives you an opportunity to have conversations with people who have vastly different moral beliefs in a way that's actually respectful and productive, rather than just sort of, people banging their fists on a table and, deleting relatives from Facebook.
Unfriend.
Yeah, exactly, right? It's a lot easier to unfriend people. I think
stay in your bubble.
Exactly, right? And like one nice thing about bioethics is that it gives you a set of tools so that when you're outside of your bubble, you can actually have a productive discussion. And that's, of course, dependent on the other person wanting to meet you halfway. But I think, if we have train people to be able to recognize the difference between putting forward a reasoned claim and just stating an opinion without anything to back it up, or for people to recognize what are some bad forms of arguing. We might make some modicum of progress here. That's me being an optimist.
And I would say, more recently, the Center of Bioethics had a guest lecture on communicating, science to policymakers. Can you tell us just about who came and a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, this was great. This was Andrew Schroeder, who came and talked about presenting complex scientific results to policymakers, specifically some of the ethical questions involved in that, because scientists may sometimes I'm getting over being sick. Scientists may sometimes wonder how much they should be trying to pitch a particular policy agenda when they're explaining their research in venues that may be presented to policymakers. Should they just be saying, hey, here are my results, or should they be specifically trying to pressure a particular policy to be adopted? And that may depend a lot on the nature of the research that they're doing and the nature of the policy question. But part of what Andrew Schroeder was doing was engaging with some of the models that bioethics already has available and seeing if they can provide insights into this question. So we already do have models for thinking about the obligations within a healthcare setting. What sorts of information should doctors be providing to patients? And part of the thought was whether those models can shed some light on the kinds of communication that also happens between scientists and ideally policymakers.
Yeah, that must have been quite interesting to.
It was, yeah.
Yeah. I would, we're about to wrap up now, but one question I have to ask both of you is like, what motivates you to continue to do this type of work, to do this type of research?
So some of it is it just really interesting? I find these to be really fascinating questions. And some of it is that I do think that it's important to really be trying to make sense of the political and ethical questions that we're facing in our lives and as a community. And some of this is me just trying to grapple with that and trying to take the little baby steps forward of making sense of this and trying to figure out how it is that we're supposed to be living together.
How about for you?
Yeah, so I share Chelsea's sentiments. I'd say, like, if an academic tells you they're not doing it for because they just find it independently interesting, they're probably lying. These are questions that just sort of fascinate me. Like, they're the things that keep me up at night when I'm not worrying about, whether I sent an email or something, right? But ultimately, I just find it so rewarding to be able to have these conversations with people. I mean, for most of us, the hardest ethical situations we're going to find ourselves in are ones that are going to relate to health in some way, right? Do I get the abortion? Do I push for this sort of treatment that I believe is futile? How do I take care of my aging relatives? And I like that I'm able to have conversations that are both philosophically rich, but also practically applicable, that are going to, hopefully inform the sorts of decisions that people make going forward.
Wow.
So it's really a fun field to be in.
I have learned a lot. I have several moral dilemmas at the moment. But thank you guys so much for being on our show today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah.
And these were great questions.
Yeah, and to our audience, please visit our website at publichealth.nyu.edu. You can learn more and ask more questions, and we'll definitely reach back out. Thank you.